Hey, email geeks, welcome to the Email Design Podcast, where we talk about the latest in email design and development. As always, we are your hosts. I'm Kevin Mandeville.
And I'm Jason Rodriguez.
Coming up on today's podcast, we're going to be talking about GMX and web.de rendering, Retina images and email, and a fun little adventure into some Microsoft Outlook documentation. We're going to kick things off today, Jason, talking about an SVG timer in email. And this was an amazing project from Style Campaign. Miss Anna Yeaman and Graham over at Style Campaign. They basically figured out how to do an SVG countdown timer in email, which was fantastic. And we'll get into sort of the steps that they went about figuring out how to do this. The first thing that they did, which I thought was pretty incredible, is that they actually did an initial prototype using straight up pixel art. So literally using table cells and just changing the colors on each of the cells and the clock design and using CSS animation to just see if it was possible and if it could work out. So first, I thought that was pretty cool. And there was a total of 42 synchronized animation sequences to make that up. So there was a 6-digit display, 7 elements for the table cells for each digit. So that made up 42 different types of animations, which I thought was pretty cool, just breaking down the actual clock and how to control all that. And the thing about using CSS is that you can't dynamically set that for a time. So the obvious answer was to use an external CSS file that was going to be generated from a PHP script from a server, right? And actually, I've actually tried playing around with the CSS-only countdown clock before, and Anna, I thought was cool because I haven't been exploring the SVG implementation, but she talks about CSS animation a bit and some of the drawbacks or challenges to it. And the thing about using CSS animation for time like this is that the way CSS animation works with keyframes, from using 0% to 100%, you deal with rounding errors a little bit because you start getting into like thousandths of percent or whatnot. It's really easy to do like a simple hour countdown, but once you start getting into longer, multiple hours and days, the timing gets off just a little bit because CSS is having to do all that calculation itself. So that was a little bit of a challenge with that. And that's when she sort of, and also to cut down on things, turned to SVG as a potential option to control the countdown instead. And it's pretty amazing. I mean, she actually had built a 3D modeling piece of software a few years ago, and she converted she has a 3D to SVG conversion tool that she did for actually creating the clock that she made, which was pretty cool. And essentially the way that this is set up is that there's 3 layers. So there's the clock in the very back of the background. Then there's just a color fill layer on top of that, and then a finished the word that says finish for an end state on top of that, so that there can be the clock, but then when the clock is officially counted down, it sort of has a finished state. The demo that's set up, it's set up on a 24-hour loop with a deadline of 8 p.m. Pacific Standard Time, and then there's like a 30-minute reset period from that point. So if you're ever checking it out. But it's pretty cool. So she created those 3 different SVGs, and they only added up to 10 kilobytes for the SVGs. And then looking at sort of the fallback state, they could have used dynamic images. And I think if you were to do an actual campaign, it's unavoidable to turn to dynamic images for full support. But they just wanted to prototype using only SVG and CSS and HTML for the most part. So for the fallback state for clients where it wasn't supported, they just showed the word timer. And then they would just progressively enhance from there. It was interesting looking at Android. So CSS for 2.3, external CSS is supported, but not SVG. Or the SVG was there, but it wasn't animating for 4.0 to 4.3. So what they did was they actually realized that fill color had less support than fill opacity. So the solution was to animate fill opacity instead, which then brought support to Android 4.0 to 6.0. And then for 2.3, they used basically device detection from the user agent string and a PHP script to deliver a dynamic CSS file for that, so that it would basically have a custom separate fallback for that. And I think that's one of the most interesting points of this, Jason, looking into using dynamic CSS files like you would for images generated from a PHP script and detecting a device that way. I think that's something interesting I've never done with. I'd like to explore more. And then they showed that for Internet Explorer, i.e. it doesn't have the full SVG support for animation, but what they did was they just had the set time when the email was open. So it didn't say timer, but however much time was left on the countdown. It wasn't animated and the clock didn't work, but it had that just static time as well. It was pretty cool. It worked the full support at the end using the SVG and CSS animation. Android 4.0 to 6.0, Apple Mail, Outlook for Macs on 2011 and 2016, iOS Mail, if I didn't say that, and then Sparrow and Malto, odd iOS apps like that. But it was pretty cool. I mean, I think this is a pretty amazing implementation and a pretty great campaign, or demo anyways.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, that's my favorite part about that is that Anna and Graham are taking so much time to experiment with stuff like this. And this definitely isn't the first time we've seen really revolutionary techniques come from Style Campaign. So this is kind of the latest in a long line of really interesting experiments that they've been working on both internally and for some of their clients. So that was definitely my favorite part, is seeing this level of detail into this experimentation and the final outcome, which is damned impressive. I also like too that, Anna kind of mentions that CSS animation is probably the most ill-conceived animation system I've ever come across. So we kind of talk about it a lot, and we love it for kind of more basic or fun animations and email campaigns when you're trying to pull off something that needs to be a lot more precise, like a countdown timer. You mentioned, Kevin, that it's very tricky to do that with CSS animations alone because of how those keyframe animations are set up. But yeah, great work from Anna and Graham, and hopefully this won't be the last really interesting experiment we see out of Style Campaign.
Yeah. And I also like the optimizations they did at the end. The external CSS file size, it started at about 400 kilobytes and they got it down to 60. And she even talked about how if you could take out WebKit prefixes for less Android support, if that wasn't a big part of your audience, to cut it down to even 30 kilobytes. I just think there's a lot of interesting applications here. And I also think that SVG is pretty cool, but I also think there's some areas to explore for just a pure CSS solution, which I might do. Probably better for a short timed countdown, but I think there's a lot of cooler things to look at countdowns besides just the standard dynamic images from a PHP script like we've seen, which I think Anna and Graham have shown here.
Cool. Moving on, something potentially a little less exciting than an SVG timer. But a little while back on Litmus, we introduced a couple of new email clients for testing. And those are two German webmail clients, GMX and web.de. So we published a blog post to kind of coincide with launching these email clients for testing in the Litmus application, kind of detailing what's involved with webmail clients in Germany, actually rendering your email, what it looks like. The good news is that both GMX and web.de don't have anything too crazy going on when they're actually displaying your email campaigns. They essentially work similar to AOL Mail, where your email's stuck in an iframe and shown in the browser. So they don't have to worry about doing really funky things to your code, like folks like Gmail, or some of the Outlook clients, So your code is generally rendered really, really well, and they have good support for most things you're going to do in an email campaign. The other good news is that they automatically display images by default, which is absolutely fantastic. You should still account for images off displays, because a lot of clients do disable those images by default. So you want to use things like alt text and styled alt text to get your message across even when the images aren't displayed. Some other good stuff, they have support for animated GIFs, which is fantastic if you're using that to create a sense of motion or surprise or delight in your email campaigns. The only real bad thing is that they don't have good support for some more advanced HTML and CSS. So the big one we noted is that it doesn't support HTML5 video, but that's kind of par for the course. Most email clients aren't supporting that. So there's a strong argument maybe you shouldn't be using HTML5 video and you should rely on different techniques in your email campaigns. But the one that is making me a little bit sad, but I guess really isn't a big deal in the long run, is that neither client supports the CSS border radius property. So if you're using the border radius property like we do to get nice rounded corners on your buttons, on content blocks, stuff like that, then you will see those squared off corners in those two email clients. But other than that, they're pretty solid email clients. They don't do anything really weird to campaigns. It's not something like using an old Outlook client or some of the weird stuff that Gmail does. So you can feel safe knowing that these two German webmail clients will treat your email code kindly. But if you do want to test, both clients are available in Litmus today. You can check it out and see how your email campaigns render in both GMX and web.de.
The more that I use it, the more I compare it to Gmail as an email client, the way that it handles some things, at least when you get into the hackier stuff. I think it's similar to Gmail in which, most of them are pretty good for just rendering stylings and whatnot. When you try to get into super advanced stuff, it behaves a lot like Gmail. Actually, what was the quote, Jason? There was at TED Seed London, GMX's Gmail's annoying little sister, right? Wolfgang
something like that, yeah.
That was like one of my favorite quotes of the entire conference. So yeah, I would liken it to Gmail in terms of how it handles a lot of things. But it's not going to cause you issues like Outlook structurally or anything like that. You just might not be able to progressively enhance a lot for cool stuff. Yeah,
I think the one thing that's really interesting that Wilbert Heinen actually commented on the blog post was that the direction right to left and left to right isn't supported very well in both, which I find actually interesting because, these are German clients, which, the European Union and Europe tend to have a lot more diversity when it comes to languages spoken, languages read than something like the US. So it seems like having good support for both right to left and left to right languages in an email client would be more key or more vital to European webmail clients. But I was surprised to see that that's not very well supported. So I'm kind of curious what that kind of support is across all email clients and whether or not it's a big issue for most people. But I feel like I don't hear about it too much, so maybe it's not. But I thought that was just interesting to note too for these two.
Yeah, and those clients, they don't have massive global market share, but they are very popular in Europe. So if you know that you have a larger audience there, you probably have more opens there, and it's something important to keep in mind when you're dealing with testing and developing your emails. All right, well, we're going to take a quick break here. Just to let you guys know, you can check out the podcast at emaildesignpodcast.com. We have full show notes, links, everything we discuss, all the past episodes are right there. You can also subscribe to the podcast on iTunes, SoundCloud, and YouTube. Check us out on YouTube. Brand new up there. And you can go to litmus.com/gift card and input the coupon code podcast for 14 days free of Litmus. So you can test out GMX and WebDE now right inside Litmus. It's been great. We've been using it for all of our emails too, just to make sure things look good for our European friends out there using that client. But you can also test in those two clients, but 50 other ones as well. We have 50 plus email clients. Make sure your email is not broken in the Outlooks and Lotus Notes. If you have that, bless you. But whatever email clients you need to make sure your email looks great, just test in Litmus. Over 50 different email clients. It's right there. Great iterative process using Builder, or if you're sending in from your ESP as sort of a checklist, you can send it from your ESP as well. And we also have the analytics like we talked about, so you can see if you have a lot of European users, where they're opening their email. Are they using GMX or WebDE? You have those full insights right there. So just go to litmus.com/gift card and input the coupon code podcast for 14 days free of Litmus.
All right, heading back into it. We want to talk a little bit about Retina images in email campaigns. So I was actually surprised. A couple of weeks ago, we had our London email design conference over in London. And during, I don't know if you got questions related to Retina images, but during the workshop I ran, Kevin, there were a number of questions around using Retina images and whether or not they're necessary, how best to make your images look good on Retina devices, which was surprising to me because I feel like it's something we've used for a long time and been very aware of. But the more and more I talk to people, the more and more I find out that not everybody knows about the issue with Retina screens and keeping your images looking good on those higher DPI screens. So to address that concern, a couple months ago, I published a post on the Litmus blog called Understanding Retina Images in HTML Email, where I kind of break down what makes for Retina images and why they're important. So long story short, there have been better screens released on different devices. As we move forward, the most obvious one is the Retina display on Apple devices. But more and more manufacturers are creating these high DPI screens that essentially double the amount of pixels in a given space on the screen so that things can look much crisper than they ever have before. But for email designers, if you're still using the same old images that you always have, a lot of times you will find those images look blurry or kind of pixelated on those high DPI, high resolution displays. So the way to get around that is to use something called Retina images, which at the most basic level are essentially larger images that are scaled down to fit in your specific image dimensions. So the example I gave here was I had the Litmus logo. So we had it displaying at 130 pixels wide by 48 pixels high. So if you saw that on a Retina screen, like the MacBook Pro I'm looking at now, or an Apple iPhone, or a comparable device, then that image looks fairly blurry if it's not a very large image scaled down. So to make that image a Retina image, you'd essentially save that image twice the size it's going to be displayed at. So in this case, I could save it out as something at 260 pixels by 98 pixels, and it would be when it's scaled down, it's a lot crisper image. It's nice and clear, and it presents your brand in the best way possible. So that's a very basic kind of way to do that. But the thing to kind of keep in mind with the Retina images is that as you're saving out these larger images, the file size for those images increases as well. So that could be a huge consideration depending on your audience, whether or not there's a lot of mobile users, where in the world those mobile users are opening, because that might affect what kind of data plans they have access to and how expensive it could get for them, along with load times of those images. If it's a very large image that takes a really long time to load, then that could make a very disjointed experience for that subscriber. So there's techniques to get around this. The most common is to just compress those images as much as possible without degrading the actual quality of the image itself. So if you're used to using something like Photoshop to design your emails, which we talked about our last podcast episode, there were 81% of email designers using Photoshop to mock up their email campaigns. Photoshop has a great save for web feature that allows you to compress those images pretty well without degrading the actual image output itself. There's online tools like Image Optum, JPEG Mini, Tiny PNG, a whole host of them that we mentioned here in this article to make those a little bit better. A really interesting technique was this idea of, oh God, I forget the name of it. It's like a compressive image or something the technique was referred to.
Oh, yeah. Fabio's technique about how you can blow things up to be like 4 times as large, but setting the quality down to 0, and you get like a much smaller file size, but it doesn't impact the rendering. I have not looked at that in forever, Jason.
I haven't used that, and I don't think outside of him, maybe I haven't really talked to anybody using it, but I think it's just like such a quirky, like a weird little trick to do that. So yeah, essentially you, instead of making it 2 times the size, you make it 4, 5, 6 times the size, so it's this massive image. But when you save it at a really, really low quality setting, then it looks like absolute garbage if you view it at 100% size. But when it's scaled down, then it's really nice and crisp. But it just saves massively on file size. So that's another trick if you want to use it. But honestly, we've been happy with just saving out those lower quality images via Photoshop. I'm really partial to using Image Optim myself for my emails. So that's just that thing to keep in mind with those Retina images.
Yeah, you can Google compressive images. It's not anything that's just related to email. It's any file on the web. You can find a bunch of techniques, and I'm not the most up to date on it, to be honest with you. So you can probably figure out what's the best latest techniques, especially because I know there's definitely been some more devices and monitors with increased pixel density and such since I've read about that technique, Jason. I guess just the other thing I want to point out, I mean, yeah, it's real simple. Just 2x the photo and scale it down to the original size. But you probably only want to do that for things that need to be Retina friendly, things like logos or whatnot. You don't need to do that for like actual image photos, a photo of yourself or an event or whatever. Those photos typically don't need to be Retina photos, those, because that's where you really those file sizes get very out of hand, like actual photos. But if you're dealing with actual like vector or illustrative type art, like you want to make sure those are nice and crisp. So that those are just the only considerations I would probably add to that and just recommend as a best practice. All right, I want to go over this really cool tool that I found recently. I've been dealing more lately, Jason, with having to deal with support issues sometimes, or just dealing with other people's emails, HTML emails and whatnot. And I know a very big thing in email is CSS inlining, but when I get a final product of something inline, it's just an absolute mess to work with sometimes, right? And so I want to be like, okay, how can I clean this up just so I can read what the heck is going on in the HTML? And I know there's dev tools and all that, but just giving me a cleaner view. So I found this amazing little tool, extractcss.com. And this is basically a way for you to copy and paste a final inline HTML email, and then it will extract all of the inline CSS to be its own CSS in the head of the document, so that you can actually stay sane and see what the heck is actually going on with an email. I think this is a great way to help people troubleshoot your email. I think if you want to provide a final inline version for, so that you can see what actual tests look like, it's great. But I would start, and I'm sure there's probably other sites just like this, but being able to provide a site like this to be like, hey, if you want to clean it up, this might be helpful. And there's some other customizations like, spaces or tabs, right? Like that common argument there. Or if you want to extract only IDs, only classes, or inline styles, there's like a couple of customization options as a part of this tool as well. So just a neat little thing that can be very helpful if you ever have that use case for troubleshooting sort of HTML emails and refactoring them so that you can read what the heck is going on.
Yeah, I like this too. I wasn't really aware of it until you brought it to my attention, but a tool like this is absolutely vital, specifically for addressing like support issues, like you said, or legacy email templates if you're in a new job and you could just get dumped a bunch of emails you've never seen before. Developers talk about spaghetti code, and I feel like email, especially inline styles on email, have a tendency to become the noodliest of spaghetti code. So being able to take those styles and, extract them or outline them is a great way to see what's going on in an email campaign. So definitely check it out if you're dealing with helping others with their email code or taking on these kind of legacy projects. Then this could be a dream tool for you to figure out what the hell's going on in that email campaign.
All right, Jason, I want to hear about your recent foray into finding some Microsoft Outlook documentation.
So I don't even know if there's like a real good backstory as to why I wanted this documentation, other than I was curious about it. And I was kind of looking into that kind of holy grail of email design, which is getting rid of tables for laying out your email campaigns. So as we all know, Outlook is the main reason why we all use tables to lay out our email campaigns. So if we could get around Outlook and having to rely on tables to lay out those email campaigns, I would imagine our code would get a lot cleaner and a lot easier to read, update, and maintain. So I was looking for ways around Outlook and tables and some extra properties to use in Outlook specifically to make coding a little bit easier. So Outlook allows you to use these MSO properties, which MSO stands for Microsoft Office. It's specific to Outlook clients that use Word as their rendering engine. But it's a set of essentially kind of CSS properties that you can use on elements to affect their display, how Outlook interprets them. But unfortunately, while we have a list in the Litmus community of what those properties are, up until now, I had never seen actual documentation for what any of those properties mean. So that was what I was doing. I was hunting around. I was playing a little detective to figure out what the hell all these properties actually are. So after much time Googling, I came across this page on Microsoft's developer network that purportedly had the documentation for all the existing MSO properties. But the problem was, in kind of true Microsoft fashion, the link to the documentation didn't actually work. So that was really, really frustrating until I remembered the Wayback Machine at archive.org, which over time takes snapshots of web pages as they exist at that moment in time. So I had to dig all the way back to the very first iteration of this page, or an early iteration of this page, to get a working link to this download for this MSO documentation. So when I downloaded it, it was in a file format that I couldn't open, that I frankly didn't trust. So naturally, I went to one of our developers, Ed Giardina, and asked him to bravely open up this unknown file from the Wayback Machine online. So when he did, he found out that it was some documentation on these MSO properties, which I've since posted online and made accessible to everybody, so that if you want to look into these MSO properties and what they actually do, you can now look at that documentation and see straight from the horse's mouth what these Microsoft properties do for those Outlook email clients. Since then, I've actually discovered that somebody else did this a while back and posted it to GitHub. So all of this work was pretty much for nothing because it already existed somewhere on GitHub. But I got a good little blog post out of it and got to play detective for a while. So I guess that entertainment value is still there. But I think it's a great resource for email designers that need to access those really weird MSO properties to fix some of those things that they might run into. I think most people are familiar with some like MSO line height rule for fixing Outlook line heights. But there's definitely some weird ones in there that just looking at the name, you would not know what they're for. So having access to documentation is really cool in that respect. Since then, I still haven't figured out a way to get rid of tables in Outlook, but that's kind of the ongoing quest for most email designers, I imagine.
I think they did change their documentation recently for the design, but I do specifically remember this was online before, all of these properties and
Was
what
it?
they did.
Yeah.
And it did basically get removed, and I think they just are pointing now to, or not pointing to, I guess.
Yeah, they're not pointing at anything.
That PDF file that you came up with, which has been ace. I think actually now I'm just remembering this, but I think Stig posted it. He basically made it like just an HTML archive site for
he took that and made it
as well.
easier
We'll try to dig up that link and post it in the show notes as well. But I think it's good just being able to make sure that we don't lose any of this documentation. And I've had a blast reading through it, believe it or not. This sounds like the nerdiest thing ever, but I have spent some nights just reading through that document. And I have
watching The Bachelorette and reading through MSO
watching Bachelor in
documentation.
Paradise and reading some Microsoft Office HTML rendering engine documentation is my idea of fun, Jason.
Nice. God bless you, Kevin.
But I have not come across anything for a tableless solution yet either.
There's a couple of layout rules that could in theory help out with it, but they introduce other styling concerns that you can't really get around. So it's kind of a fool's quest at this point. But
the tough thing is that a lot of the other types of properties are still just table based. They aren't necessarily for divs, right?
Yep.
And there's not a lot you can do with divs in the Outlook rendering engine, which is the key sort of like wall we're hitting against right now. So, and there's a lot of the other stuff that I found is actually related to Excel. It's not necessarily related to Microsoft Word or what Outlook does. It's related to Excel or things like that. And a lot of things that I've tried have actually, I'm just trying to find things that it actually, like what HTML elements it can actually be applied to. I'm finding that a lot of those unique ones are just not applicable for layout style stuff, unfortunately. So we'll see where it goes. But yeah, thanks for the effort. I thoroughly enjoyed the blog post and,
No problem.
the process. All right, now we're going to get into email of the week. And the email we're going to be featuring this week is from Return Path, and it's a re-engagement email. And this is probably one of the best re-engagement emails I've seen in quite a while, Jason. It's pretty cool. It's asking if you'd like to continue to receive the emails, and you're basically presented two options. You can say, yeah, with a nice little bouncing up and down koala, or a no, crying monkey. And it's really fun because these are just two simple little CSS animations for the images of these two animals, which is really nice and a lot more personality than I typically would see from a Return Path email. And they also had, I don't know what the subject line was because I only saw the web version of this, but they also said, did you like our subject line and buttons? Did they catch your eye? Check out our Spotify playlist to see where we got our inspiration. So just a ton of personality in this email, just you can really tell that a human sat down and built this thing. It's very fun, especially for the type of user who may not be super engaged with you to begin with. Being able to show that you're this much fun and this friendly, I think is just a great strategy.
Yeah, absolutely. And I feel like they do it really well because it is so simple. And just having these fun elements are great, but just having those two options, you don't have to really reply to the email or do anything other than click a button to tell them whether or not you want to keep receiving emails from them. So I absolutely love that. My only real criticism is, and I understand where they're coming from, but the button colors kind of irk me a bit because the to actually keep engaged with the brand, keep receiving emails, when you hover over it is a red button, which in my mind means no. Red usually means stop. But I understand it because it's the Return Path brand. It's all red and white. That makes sense. The no button is black. I feel like maybe reversing those could have been a better visual indicator of what that button will do. But that's just me being super nitpicky. I absolutely love this. That damn koala and monkey, they're adorable. I love them. And yeah, like you said, the Spotify playlist thing is such a great addition. And that's a great way to not only add that like extra value of checking out some new music you might not be aware of, but that's a great kind of clever way to get feedback on whether or not the subject line or buttons caught their eye. Because in theory, if they did, you'll click that link and you can see how many people have clicked that link and gather some kind of anecdotal data from that. But this is, a fantastic campaign. The copywriting's great, the buttons are great, and most importantly, those animations are fantastic.
So great job, Return Path, for being our email of the week. All right, that's going to do it for this edition of the Email Design Podcast. Remember, you can go to emaildesignpodcast.com, catch all of our past episodes, and see the full show notes and links to everything we discussed. Subscribe to us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and YouTube. And be sure to go to litmus.com/gift card and input the coupon code podcast for 14 days of free Litmus. All right, until next time, Email Geeks, we are reminding you, keep your table cells aligned and your styles in line. See ya.